Hey lads, Mason here. Welcome to the Lore Cabin. Here, we tell stories that feel like they've been waiting for you. The kind that drift between nostalgia and legend, where the line between memory and myth begins to blur. Tonight, we follow the sound of something stirring in the sea, a lonely cry rising from the deep, the legendary Pokémon, Lugia, a creature of silence and storms, born from a dream, claimed by a franchise, and at the heart of it all was a man. If you grew up with Pokemon, you felt his touch in every line, every moment that ever stuck with you in the early days. His name was Takeshi Shudō. He gave the world of Pokemon its soul, and then watched that soul get reshaped, repackaged, and pushed beyond his reach. This is the story of a creator who dreamed too deeply, and the legendary Pokemon that rose from that dream and quietly broke him. So settle in. Let the wind outside howl. Let the rain hit the roof. You're here now, in the cabin, with us. If you enjoy stories and accounts like these, I'd love it if you'd subscribe. It helps the podcast grow and it lets me keep sharing tales like this. Quiet ones, powerful ones, the kind that leave something behind when the fire goes out. Now then, let me tell you a story. Hey.
Welcome to the Lore Cabin podcast.
In the quiet hours before dawn, a storm brews over the Pacific. Waves tumble and crash in the darkness, crowned with white foam. Above them, thunderheads churn the sky, and beneath the surface something stirs. A vast silhouette glides through the deep, its eyes closed, its heart beating in time with the ocean's current. The creature's wings, or are they fins, slowly unfurl as it senses the discord in the elements above. A low, sonorous cry vibrates through the water. On the distant horizon, a bolt of lightning splits the sky, illuminating for an instant the elegant form of a dragon-like bird rising toward the surface. Its pale body seems to glow against the black sea. It is both beautiful and strange, a being that should not exist, a guardian called forth by a world in peril. This is Lugia, the legendary Pokémon of the oceans, stirring awake. And in that same moment, thousands of miles away on land, a man bolts upright from a restless sleep, the roar of thunder still echoing in his mind. Takeshi Shudō rubs his eyes and reaches for the pen and notebook always at his bedside. He cannot ignore the image that shook him from his dreams, a great white leviathan of the sea, crying out in loneliness. Outside the window of his small Tokyo apartment, the city is dark and wet. The summer rainstorm has arrived ahead of dawn. Shudō feels the rumble of distant thunder in his chest as he hurriedly jots down a few words in the dim light. His handwriting is messy, the characters slanting from exhaustion and the fading haze of alcohol. On the table beside the bed, an empty bottle of cheap whiskey lies on its side, and a half-filled glass rests next to a small pharmacy vial of pills. The writer's tools, he might have called them wryly. For years now, Shudō has relied on these aids to chase inspiration or stave off despair. I was gulping down alcohol and drugs. I started to feel like I wanted to die, he would later confess of his lowest moments. But tonight, or this early morning, the tools have done their job. Out of a feverish sleep they have conjured a vision, a troubled creature of the deep, a lonely god of the sea. Lugia. That name did not exist in any myth or language until a short while ago. It was born in a sterile conference room under fluorescent lights in a meeting where cigarette smoke mixed with the scent of instant coffee and stress. Shudō remembers it clearly. A few months earlier, he had sat in that crowded room at the headquarters of OLM Studio, surrounded by executives from various arms of the sprawling Pokémon franchise. Representatives from Game Freak, the video game developers, were there, as were liaisons from TV Tokyo and toy distribution companies. The Pokémon phenomenon was at its peak, and whatever this meeting produced would be critical. They were all there to discuss one thing, the upcoming second Pokémon movie, and the mysterious new creature Shudō had dreamed up to star in it. At that time, in early planning documents and hushed conversations, the creature had only a code name, Pokémon X. Shudō had coined that placeholder himself while drafting the script. Pokémon X was to be unlike any monster seen before, a creator of all life on Earth that symbolizes the ocean currents. In Shudō's imagination, it was a being born from the depths of the sea, a guardian deity with dominion over the elements. He envisioned it as a maternal figure, a maternal Pokémon, nurturing and ancient, embodying both the calm and the fury of nature. Pokémon X would have both male and female sides intertwined within it, transcending gender, much like the sea itself, which can be gentle or ferocious, life-giving or life-taking. This was the lofty concept Shudō carried in his heart as he wrote the film's story. But in that meeting room, lofty concepts had to be sold and solidified. The first matter was to choose a final name. Shudō watched as the committee tossed around possibilities. He offered little input. Perhaps in his mind no name could fully capture what this creature meant to him. In the end, a majority vote settled it. A soft sound starting low in the chest and ending with a gentle exhale. Lugia. It felt fitting enough. Shudō learned later that the name may have roots in Latin or other languages, lutier meaning to lie dormant, or an allusion to the beluga whale, but to him it simply became the vessel for Pokémon X. From that day on, his creation had a public identity, Lugia, the guardian of the sea. Shudō could not have known then how far beyond his grasp Lugia would drift. He had created this new Pokémon solely for the movie, a tale to stand on its own. In his mind, Lugia would soar for one summer on the silver screen and then sleep again beneath the waves, like a myth that appears in the world only when needed. But others had different plans. As discussions continued, Shudō listened quietly to the game developers, murmuring among themselves. He caught words like gold and silver, the upcoming pair of Pokémon games. There was talk of synergy, of cross-promotion. His heart sank a little. He was surprised to learn later that Lugia ended up used in the games and TV show, integrated into the wider Pokémon canon as if it had always been meant to live there. Unknown to Shudō, the decision had been made to elevate Lugia beyond a one-off film character. The executives chose Lugia as the mascot for Pokémon Silver version. It was rumored it even replaced another planned creature at the last minute with Lugia's image on the box art. This was extraordinary. Almost every other Pokémon had originated in the games first, then migrated to animation. But Lugia was born in Shudō's screenplay and was adopted by the games after the fact. It was a reversal of the usual order, and a testament to how powerful the Pokémon machine had become. No opportunity for a new icon would be left untapped. For Shudō, however, those concerns were secondary in 1998, as he threw himself into writing the film. The first Pokémon movie, Mewtwo Strikes Back, had been a surprise triumph born under unusual circumstances. Just as he had begun drafting that initial film script, fate intervened. In December 1997, an episode of the Pokémon TV series infamously sent hundreds of children into seizures with its strobing lights. The Pokémon shock incident threw the franchise into chaos. The anime was pulled off air for 4 long months, while doctors and regulatory bodies investigated. It was a dark and terrifying moment for Pokémon's reputation. Yet, for Takeshi Shudō hunched at his desk, it was oddly liberating. Right before Mewtwo Strikes Back, an unfortunate incident occurred. A flashing sequence in the Pokémon anime caused a number of viewers to have seizures. I think the film management team was so busy dealing with that situation, they didn't have time to worry about the script, Shudō later reflected. With the usual executive oversight momentarily distracted, Shudō was free to write the story he wanted to tell. And what a story it was. Mewtwo Strikes Back opened not like a children's cartoon, but like science fiction tragedy. The genetically engineered Pokémon Mewtwo awakens in a laboratory, and realizing the existential horror of his captivity, destroys his creators in cold blood. That scene, scientists screaming as glass explodes and the laboratory burns around the enraged creature, would never have survived committee scrutiny under normal circumstances. But it made it to screen, and it shocked young audiences in the best way. Here was a Pokémon film that did not coddle its viewers. It challenged them. It asked questions about the ethics of creation, the meaning of existence, and the loneliness of being unique in a world that fears you. These themes of the existence of self ran through the film, entwined with the simpler adventure on the surface. Some children surely just enjoyed the battles and the spectacle, but older fans and parents could sense the deeper currents Shudō had imbued in the narrative. When Mewtwo Strikes Back premiered in summer 1998, it exceeded all expectations and became a massive hit. In Japan, families packed theaters. In the United States, it broke records for an anime release and became a cultural event in its own right. The film's success secured Shudō a powerful, if rare, currency: creative freedom. The chief producer of the Pokémon films approached Shudō after seeing the profits and accolades roll in. As Shudō later recounted with a touch of amusement, the producer told him, "I have some concerns about certain aspects of the first movie, but since it was such a huge success, I won't interfere with the second one. I just want you to put explosive birth in the title." The producer was true to his word. For the sequel, Shudō was given an almost unheard of level of control over the story and content. The only mandate was that the Japanese title must include the words explosive birth, a flashy marketing buzzword to promise excitement. And so the project known as Pokémon X, now titled Mirage Pokémon: Lugia's Explosive Birth, began in earnest. Shudō poured his soul into the script. He constructed a tale of nature out of balance. In the film, an avaricious collector named Lawrence III attempts to capture the three legendary bird Pokémon, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, to satisfy his ego. In doing so, he disrupts the delicate harmony of climate and currents. Fiery eruptions, thunderous storms, and glacial upheavals ravage the region. The world teeters on the brink of an ecological catastrophe. Only the awakening of the Guardian of the Sea can quell the chaos. This Guardian, of course, is Lugia, but Lugia alone is not enough. The legend says that a chosen one must unite the power of the three symbols of the elements and bring them to Lugia, like offerings to appease an angry god. In Shudō's screenplay, that chosen one is a child, Ash Ketchum, the eternal 10-year-old Pokémon trainer, whose journey Shudō had shepherded from the beginning. It is a grand fantasy adventure, but Shudō's touch makes it something more. Looking back, even though the second Pokémon movie was intended for kids, it subtly dealt with topics hardly meant for children, such as the existence of self and coexistence, Shudō noted in his blog, with understated pride. Coexistence, that was the heart of Lugia's story. Where the first film asked, "Who am I?" the second asked, "How can we all live together?" In the climactic moments of the movie, humans and Pokémon must learn to trust each other and work in unison to calm the fury that man's hubris has unleashed. Ash, representing all of humanity in a sense, must humble himself and serve nature's cause rather than trying to dominate it. It is Lugia that articulates the lesson. In a soaring scene, Ash finds himself in the eye of the storm, atop a pillar of rock in the raging sea. The skies are black, lightning everywhere. Lugia rises from the churning ocean and speaks to Ash, not with lips but telepathically, a voice echoing directly in the boy's mind. Disturb not the harmony of fire, ice, or lightning, the creature intones, reciting an ancient prophecy that warns against human arrogance. The voice is deep, resonant, almost echoing. In the film, it was performed by a male actor whose tones conveyed power and gravitas. Ash listens, wide-eyed and shivering, as this mythical being entrusts him with the fate of the world. All around them, the three elemental birds shriek and clash, each representing a force of nature unleashed. Ash, guided by Lugia, races to gather the three treasures that will signal peace, the treasures of ice, lightning, and fire from the islands each bird rules. He nearly drowns in the process, plunging into the tempestuous ocean to retrieve the final treasure. There is a brief, tender moment where his friend Misty dives in after him, saving him from sinking into the abyss. Shudō hadn't planned that specifically as a sentimental beat, but more on that later. Finally, with the help of his loyal Pokémon companions and friends, Ash delivers the treasures to their resting place. Then a young island girl, a ceremonial melody maiden, plays an ocarina flute, producing an ethereal song that echoes across the waters. At that moment, Lugia itself begins to sing. This is perhaps the most haunting scene in the film. The giant silver-white creature hovers above the ocean, closes its eyes, and releases a sonorous, wail-like lament that intertwines with the girl's flute melody. The song of Lugia, as it is known, spreads calm over the warring elements. The enraged birds cease their fighting and settle, The thunder and lava subside. The black clouds part to reveal clear skies. Balance returns to nature as the ocean's guardian carries Ash gently on its back, circling upward through shafts of sunlight breaking through the clouds. The visuals are breathtaking, a triumph of animation and music working in harmony. And for children in the audience, it is pure magic, a thrilling adventure resolving in a moment of transcendent peace. Yet if one looks closer, there is something profoundly maternal in that moment. Lugia's role in the story is not to conquer or defeat the other Pokémon, but to soothe them, to give the world a wind of renewal and restoration, as the islander's legend says. Shudō had indeed conceived Lugia as a kind of mother, a guardian not just of the sea, but of life's balance. The creature's very design was imbued with subtle symbols of this concept. Early concept art drawn by Ken Sugimori, at Shudō's direction, showed Lugia with a prominent X-shaped mark on its chest, a literal X for the codename Pokémon X, but perhaps also a nod to the female chromosome, or the crossroads of dual natures. In that sketch, Lugia had fewer dorsal plates and a slightly different silhouette, but the essence was there, a majestic dragon bird meant to be unique, singular, and nurturing. In the later anime series, traces of this concept surfaced when a Lugia was depicted as a caring parent to a baby Lugia, a storyline where a scientist even refers to the adult Lugia by the codename Pokémon X. Though Shudō did not write those episodes, it was as if the universe of Pokémon itself remembered Lugia's original spirit and let it slip out in that tale of mother and child. But in the summer of 1999, as Pokémon the Movie 2000, The Power of One, as it was titled overseas, rolled out worldwide, most viewers knew none of this backstory. They simply saw Lugia as a new legendary Pokémon, powerful and awe-inspiring. Many likely assumed Lugia was male because of that deep, commanding voice with which it spoke, the voice that Shudō never wanted it to have. In Shudō's mind, Lugia was both male and female at once, an androgynous being. More precisely, he leaned towards Lugia being female, a queen of the sea rather than a king. He'd quietly hoped to cast a woman to voice Lugia, to underscore its maternal nature and set it apart from other legendary Pokémon like Mewtwo, who had been voiced by a man. But he kept those hopes to himself in the early production stages, focusing on the script and trusting that details like casting could be sorted out later. It was a miscalculation that he would regret bitterly. By the time Shudō raised his concern about Lugia's gender and voice, the marketing machine had already roared to life. Trailers for the movie were playing in theaters and on TV. These advertisements featured Lugia with an unmistakably masculine, roaring voice. To change direction now, to ask the producers to find a female voice actor and redub Lugia's lines, would have been infeasible and embarrassing to the studio. Shudō was told it was too late. Lugia was locked in as male. The creator's intentions would have to yield to the momentum of what had been advertised and what presumably the audience expected to hear. That night, after receiving the final word that no changes could be made, Takeshi Shudō returned to his apartment and closed the door. Perhaps he turned on the TV and saw one of the very commercials he wished he could undo. Lugia bursting from the sea, bellowing in a baritone timbre, "I have been expecting you, chosen one." The thought of it was like a knife twisting in Shudō's gut. This wasn't right. Lugia is the ocean's guardian, the life giver, he thought. It should sound like a mother cradling the world, not an angry god. On his blog, which he wrote more than a decade later, Shudō described his reaction in stark, painful terms. Advertisements had already been aired. It was too late. We couldn't suddenly change Lugia into a female. I was gulping down alcohol and drugs. I started to feel like I wanted to die. In that single sentence, casually nested amid recollections of production meetings and story ideas, Shudō revealed the depth of his despair. A simple creative decision, the gender of a fictional creature's voice, had shaken him so profoundly it left a shadow over his well-being. It is hard for outsiders to fully grasp why this mattered so much. But to Shudō, Lugia was not just another Pokémon. It was a piece of his spirit, a rare thing he had crafted free from the usual committee meddling. Its maternal, dual-gender nature was symbolic of the very message of coexistence he was trying to convey. He saw Lugia as a bridge between opposites, land and sea, human and Pokémon, male and female. Stripping that away and making it strictly masculine felt to him like a betrayal of the character's soul, and perhaps it was also the straw that broke the camel's back. Years of small compromises, of pushing down his more radical ideas for the sake of a family-friendly brand, all crystallized into this one blow. Lugia's voice was the line he wished he'd fought harder to hold. So Shudō did what he'd unfortunately learned to do too well. He self-medicated the pain away. A bottle, a few pills, anything to numb the feeling that his creative vision was being suffocated. Outside, the summer storm likely raged on. Tokyo's weather that year brought many typhoons. But inside, Shudō sank into a solitary darkness. He later hinted that during these moments he truly felt he might not wake to see the next morning. Yet he did wake, and he carried on. He saw the project through, professional that he was. On July 17, 1999, Revelation Lugia, as the film was also called in Japan, playing off Apocalypse or Revelation in its title, premiered to enthusiastic audiences. Shudō attended the screenings and smiled for the cameras as needed. The film was another box office success, both in Japan and later abroad. Children around the world came away humming Lugia's haunting melody and clutching Lugia toys, mesmerized by this new, majestic legendary. If Shudō's heart ached as he heard kids imitating Lugia's deep roar, he mostly kept it to himself. Some who knew him, however, could see the toll the pressure had taken. Colleagues noticed Shudō's hands trembling slightly as he lit cigarettes, the way dark circles had made permanent homes under his eyes. The man was not yet 50, but his hair was thinning and grey at the temples, and fatigue clung to him like a persistent shadow. Years of overwork, and quietly, of substance use, were carving their marks. Still, Shudō pushed ahead. He had one more Pokémon movie to write after all. In 2000, Shudō scripted Pokémon 3, Spell of the Unknown, which would end up being the last Pokémon feature film he ever wrote. By now, one might expect that the weight of expectations and the bruises of past conflicts would have driven him to deliver a safer, simpler story. Instead, Shudō crafted perhaps his most personal tale yet, a story of a little girl's grief and the illusionary worlds we create to cope with loss. In that film, a young girl named Molly tragically loses her father, who disappears during an archaeological expedition, spirited away by enigmatic creatures called Unknown. Overwhelmed by loneliness, Molly's desperate wishes bring forth a fantasy. The legendary beast Entei, a lion-like Pokémon of fire, appears and assumes the role of her father, and with the Unknown's power, they seal themselves in a crystal palace of dreams. Ash Ketchum and his friends passing by get drawn into this phantasmagoria when Ash's own mother is pulled inside to be Molly's substitute mother. The entire movie is a psychological fable draped in Pokémon clothing, more Alice in Wonderland than typical monster adventure. It deals with absences, with a child's pain, and the blurred line between reality and imagination as a form of solace. Of course, it also had battles and a happy resolution. Ash helps Molly accept reality and reunites with her father miraculously rescued, but the undercurrent was undeniably poignant and mature. Watching it, some attentive fans felt a melancholy that seemed to emanate from behind the script. Was it a coincidence that Molly's situation, a child longing for her absent father, mirrored in some abstract way Pokémon's own relationship with Shudō? He had been like a father figure to the series' narrative, and by the time that third movie came out in mid-2000, he was already stepping back, letting go of his child. Perhaps that's reading too much into it, but Shudō's colleagues observed that he poured all his remaining energy into that script, polishing it meticulously. It was as if he knew it might be his last statement in this world he helped create. While working on the third movie, Shudō also continued to oversee the ongoing TV anime as chief writer, series composer, at least nominally. But burnout was seeping in, week after week, year after year of churning out episodes about a boy and his Pikachu had drained the well of Shudō's inspiration, and the friction with executives who wanted formula over innovation had worn him down. The man who once conjured a dark clone struggling with existence or a goddess of the sea now sometimes struggled to come up with yet another forest adventure or Pokémon of the Week storyline. He had ideas, wildly ambitious ones, but they would break the Pokemon world if he ever tried to execute them. And one idea in particular haunted him: a possible ending to the entire Pokemon saga. For as long as the anime had aired, Takeshi Shudō had quietly wondered how it should end. A story, after all, needs an ending to be truly meaningful, a lesson he internalized from literature and film. But Pokemon was different. It was not planned as a finite story. It was a commercial juggernaut designed to perpetuate itself as long as there were new games, new generations of kids, and money to be made. Shudō understood this well. Continuing into perpetuity is the series' objective, he wrote, with a touch of resignation. Still, he allowed himself the creative exercise of imagining, just for himself, what a perfect final episode or movie might be, if he could truly write Pokemon's ending. One concept he toyed with was gentle and nostalgic. An elderly Ash Ketchum, sitting quietly and reflecting on his life. In Shudō's vision, many years would pass. Ash would grow into an old man, and one day look back, remembering his childhood adventures with Pikachu, Misty, Brock, and all the friends and Pokemon he had met. Perhaps life after childhood hadn't been so magical. Maybe Ash grew up to face the mundane reality we all do. But in his heart, he carried those precious memories. Shudō imagined showing an aging Ash who remembers everything that happened during his adventures as a young boy, with a fond smile. Then he hears his mother's voice like an echo from the past. "Go to sleep already. You're setting off on your journey tomorrow." Ash closes his eyes, and when he opens them, he is a child again. It's the morning of his very first day as a Pokemon trainer, the day the series began. His entire journey, all the episodes and movies we watched, bloom in his mind as a nostalgic dream or a metaphor for growing up. And off he goes again, young and full of wonder, not to catch Pokemon or become a Pokemon master, but to discover the meaning of existence, to discover how to coexist with others, as Shudō put it. In essence, a loop, a perpetual journey, but one where Ash and the audience get the message that the true aim was understanding and friendship, not glory. It's a beautiful thought, almost poetic. Stand By Me meets Pokemon, since Shudō was directly inspired by that film's theme of childhood adventure looked back on with adult nostalgia. But Shudō also had a far more incendiary idea lurking in his mind, very different in tone. It was nothing less than an upheaval of the entire Pokemon world order, a Pokemon revolution. If the gentle ending was his love letter to childhood, the revolution was his attempt at a grand statement about the franchise's unspoken ethical tension. Pokemon, after all, are portrayed as companions, even friends to humans, but the fact remains that humans capture Pokemon in devices and command them to battle. Shudō had always been uncomfortable with glossing over that dynamic. In one of his columns, he noted how odd it was that Pokemon willingly got caught and fought, given that they have human-like intelligence and emotions. So he pondered, what if one day they said enough? Shudō envisioned a final movie where the Pokemon realize they are essentially enslaved and exploited by humans, and they stage a mass rebellion, much like Spartacus leading the slaves in ancient Rome. Imagine the shock, beloved Pokemon turning against their trainers, not out of some mind control or external evil, but out of their own free will and indignation. In Shudō's outline, Ash's Pikachu would become the leader of this uprising, the very first Pokemon who ever bonded with a human in the series, the symbol of friendship between species, would conclude that this friendship was a lie, that Pokemon had been used. It would rally others to its cause, and an all-out war between humans and Pokemon would erupt. Ash, heartbroken and desperate, would try to stop Pikachu, leading to a final confrontation between the boy and his best friend, an unimaginable scenario for fans, which is exactly why Shudō found it powerful. Team Rocket's role in this hypothetical story was darkly ironic. Jesse, James, and Meowth would attempt to interpret between the sides, using Meowth's ability to speak human language to mediate, but they would fail disastrously, perhaps twisting the messages and escalating the conflict by mistake. Chaos would ensue, cities overrun by rampaging Pokemon seeking their freedom, humans trying every means to contain creatures that were once loyal. It would be apocalyptic and would truly have to end the series. There could be no going back to light adventures after that. Shudō admitted that if he wrote this, it would literally mean writing the final episode ever, and that was why the idea remained locked in his desk drawer and in the corners of his mind. He could never actually create it under the Pokémon Company's watch. He said almost bitterly that he tried to think of a different plot, but I couldn't. The revolution was the only dramatically honest conclusion he could see, yet it was the one story he was absolutely forbidden to tell. Notably, Shudō had sown seeds for this scenario in earlier episodes when he had a bit more freedom. He wrote a story where wild Tentacool and Tentacruel attacked a human city as revenge for environmental damage, and another where a drowsy psychic wave caused Ash's Pikachu and others to rebel against humans briefly, an episode ironically titled Pikachu Revolts. These were episodes of the anime's first seasons that had an undercurrent of that dark idea. Even Mewtwo in the first movie shows a shade of it by questioning why Pokémon should serve humans at all, though the English version amplified that theme more than the original. Shudō was clearly wrestling with this notion throughout his tenure. It's telling that years after Shudō's departure and death, the franchise introduced Team Plasma and their leader N in the Black and White games, whose goal was to liberate Pokémon from human ownership, a concept uncannily similar to Shudō's long-ago proposal. Some fans like to think this was a quiet nod to Shudō, a way to explore his idea in a milder form. If so, it came too late for him to see it. By the end of the Johto arc of the Pokémon anime, circa 2002, Takeshi Shudō was exhausted. He had given all he could. He penned his last script for the show, episode 244, in Lighten Up, in 2002. A filler episode about a training school, innocuous and light, and then he stepped down from his role. Officially, he left to pursue other projects, to allow new talent to take the reins. Unofficially, those close to production knew that Shudō's departure had to do with accumulated creative differences and his own health. He had been frequently ill around age 50 and in and out of the hospital. The toll of late nights, stress, and self-medication could no longer be ignored. When Shudō left, the Pokémon anime underwent a subtle but noticeable transformation. The pacing changed, the content became even more child-centric and safe. Unresolved threads like the GS Ball, a mysterious artifact teased throughout Johto, was summarily dropped once Shudō was gone. Fans never got closure on it, a fact often lamented. The narrative meandered more, focusing on episodic encounters rather than overarching emotional journeys. Observers noted that some of the heart of the show seemed to fade. The special sparkle that had characterized many Kanto and Orange Islands episodes wasn't as evident in the latter half of Johto. Indeed, the Johto season gained a reputation for being somewhat stale and filler-heavy. One can't help wondering if that's because it missed Shudō's guiding hand, his willingness to occasionally break formula for an emotional payoff. Meanwhile, Shudō moved on to a quieter life. He still wrote. A creator of his caliber could never truly stop writing, but he shifted away from mainstream anime production. He contributed a regular column to a Japanese anime website called Anime Style, Anyone Can Be a Screenwriter series on Style.fm, which is where he started publishing his memoirs and musings about his Pokémon days. These blog entries, each numbered and often given dramatic titles like Lugia Apocalypse or Deep Ocean Currents of Movie 2, became a treasure trove of behind-the-scenes insight, albeit shared in Japanese to a relatively small, online readership at the time. Shudō was refreshingly candid in these writings. He spoke about things the official company line would never acknowledge, like his own dissatisfaction with elements of the show or the reasons certain characters were removed. For example, one entry detailed why Misty, or Kasumi for Japanese audiences, left the show at the end of Johto. Shudō revealed, somewhat bluntly, that out of all characters in the show, Kasumi's existence was the least justified. She had originally been added just to appeal to young girl viewers, and as the series went on, he felt her role didn't develop strongly. Thus, when changes were needed to refresh the cast, Misty was the obvious candidate to write off. It wasn't personal or due to voice actors, as rumors claimed, just a practical decision from Shudō's writing perspective. This confirmation coming straight from Shudō simultaneously saddened and vindicated fans who had speculated for years about it. Another blog entry, one of his most famous, delved into the question of real-world animals in Pokémon. Sharp-eyed viewers had noticed that in the very early episodes of the anime, Things like real fish or birds occasionally appeared in the background, but later on, the world seemed to consist entirely of Pokémon, as if they had replaced normal wildlife. Shudō addressed this curiosity with his characteristic blend of imagination and logic. By the way, real animals are extinct in the Pokémon world, only appearing in legends, he wrote matter-of-factly. In the novelization he wrote for the anime, yes, Shudō also penned a light novel adaptation of the Pokémon series early on. He had casually mentioned this, that long ago, real animals just died out and Pokémon took their ecological niches. It was a small world-building detail he cared about for consistency's sake. He acknowledged that unfortunately a few real animal cameos slipped into the animation, but he suggested with a wink that viewers imagine those were simply Pokémon that happened to look exactly like real animals. This whimsical explanation delighted fans. It was the kind of minor lore question that could spark endless forum debates, now answered by the master himself. Beyond such tidbits, Shudō's blogs often veered into the reflective and philosophical. He wrote about nostalgia and the core theme of the Pokémon anime. One of his columns, for instance, discussed how the anime's theme was influenced by Stand By Me, as mentioned earlier. He shared how he intentionally structured Team Rocket, Jessie, James, and Meowth to be ageless, timeless antagonists who appear in almost every episode without ever really changing or getting older, so that the series could maintain a consistent feel of an endless childhood summer. Those characters, being adults who never grow old or succeed, acted almost like guardians of the status quo, comedic foils ensuring Ash's journey remained a light-hearted adventure rather than a progression towards a goal. Shudō was self-aware that Ash would never win a Pokémon League in a spectacular finale under his watch, because that would mark an end, and endings were not allowed. So he instead channeled narrative energy into character moments, humor, and occasional poignancy within the perpetual middle of the story. It was perhaps this self-awareness, knowing he was tasked with writing an eternal second act, that drove Shudō at times to frustration and drink. In one remarkable blog entry, translated years later by dedicated fans, Shudō openly talks about his use of substances. He admitted he often wrote scripts in the early morning hours, while under the influence of alcohol and sometimes tranquilizers or stimulants. This wasn't an affectation or a boast. He explained in an almost clinical tone that those substances seemed to help switch on his creative mind, to crystallize his thoughts when he was stuck. He would sit at his desk, physically exhausted, and then methodically allow the chemicals to stir his brain into either a frenzy of ideas or a state of focused calm where ideas could solidify. It's a dangerous practice, and he knew it, but he felt it was one of the only ways he could meet the unrelenting deadlines and imbue his work with a spark of the unusual. In the short term, perhaps it did conjure brilliance. The man's track record speaks for itself, but in the long term, it wore his body down. Years later, after Shudō's passing, one of his fellow writers would recall that Shudō kept a small flask in his coat pocket during work and sometimes popped pills during script meetings. At the time, in the late 90s, this was shrugged off as the quirks of an eccentric genius. The animation industry in Japan has never been kind to the health of its creators. All-night writing marathons and substance-fueled work sessions were not unheard of among old-school screenwriters and manga artists. But Shudō's case perhaps stood out because his imagination was so feverish and fertile that one couldn't disentangle where the man's natural creativity ended and where the stimulants began. He was known for witty dialogue and unique next episode previews that often broke the fourth wall or included clever puns. Those humorous asides in the anime, often delivered by Team Rocket or the narrator, gave Pokémon's early episodes a distinctly Shudō flavor. It's ironic that such light, funny touches were born from a man who at times was drowning his sorrows alone at 4 a.m., chasing clarity in a haze of smoke and liquor. One anecdote Shudō shared on his blog captures the quiet clash between his artistic ethos and the more commercial demands of his job. He described a big Pokémon meeting during the development of the Lugia movie, where various higher-ups were present. Shudō, never one to enjoy bureaucratic meetings, had told the film's director, Kunihiko Yuyama, that he'd largely stay silent and let Yuyama handle any tough questions. Sure enough, early in the meeting, some executive piped up with a query that made Shudō's blood quietly boil. Which one is the scene that's supposed to make you cry? The question implied that the movie must have a calculated tearjerker moment, a standard trope in family films. Shudō was taken aback. The what? He thought. I never had any intention of including a scene that's supposed to make you cry, he wrote, still bristling at the memory. Since youth, Shudō had hated the idea of artificially manipulating an audience's emotions. If people cried at his stories, it should be because they felt moved, not because he, the writer, telegraphed, okay everyone, cry now. In his blog, he eloquently stated that a viewer's tears belong to that viewer. They are personal, a treasure of their emotional experience. To claim those tears as a writer by manufacturing a moment was, in his eyes, almost disrespectful. During that meeting, as Shudō sat in stony silence, director Yuyama quickly improvised an answer to satisfy the suits. Oh, the scene where Misty saves Ash from drowning. That's the big emotional moment. Yuyama's answer wasn't based on Shudō's intent, but was a convenient scene to point to. Indeed, Misty pulling Ash from the water is touching, but Shudō hadn't written it with the goal of making kids cry. It was just true to Misty's character to risk herself for her friend. The executives nodded. Box ticked, presumably. Shudō said nothing, but inside he was furious. I was pretty pissed. I still remember, even though the meeting was about 10 years ago, he admitted in that blog entry from 2009. Even a decade later, the memory of that trivializing question annoyed him. It represented everything he quietly fought against in commercial storytelling, the reduction of art to formulas, of viewers to targets, of moments to merchandise. Despite these inner turmoils, Shudō remained respected by his peers and adored by many fans, though most fans only came to learn of his contributions fully after he left. After stepping back from Pokémon, he kept a relatively low profile. He did a little series composition work for a science fiction anime in 2007 and tinkered with an idea for a new feature film, original not related to Pokémon, which he never got to complete. The years passed and a new generation of Pokémon sagas came, Advanced Generation Diamond and Pearl, without his involvement, but as often happens, absence made the fandom's heart grow fonder. By the late 2000s, longtime viewers and Pokémon enthusiasts began to reflect on the differences in tone and storytelling between the early seasons and the later ones. This led them back to Takeshi Shudō's name, which had appeared in the end credits of every episode until 2002 as series composition Takeshi Shudō. They realized that the man had been the architect of the Pokémon animated world they fell in love with. He gave Ash his personality, initially a bit sassy and flawed, not just a generic hero. He gave Team Rocket their flamboyant theatrics and enduring charm, including writing their famous Rocket Dan motto, the rhyming pledge Jesse and James recite, which became a franchise staple. And he infused moments of surprising depth, such as Ash's heartbreak when he thought he had to leave Pikachu behind in one early episode. Fans started translating snippets of Shudō's blog posts that leaked out on forums. They marveled at the unrealized ideas, like Ash's father potentially being a washed-up trainer, or the aforementioned final episode scenarios. Shudō, once an invisible name behind the curtain, gradually took on the aura of a legendary figure, the genius head writer of Pokémon's golden age, as one retrospective dubbed him. His faults, the heavy drinking, the arguably too dark ideas, only added to the mystique in a way, painting him as a tragic artist in a commercial world. Takeshi Shudō might have continued to watch Pokémon from afar with a mix of detached affection and resignation. He still had friends in the industry. Some of the younger writers who succeeded him would occasionally seek his counsel or at least acknowledge the foundation he'd built. But Shudō rarely commented publicly on the new direction of the series. He was done fighting those battles. Instead, in 2009, he turned inward and compiled many of his blog writings into a book, or at least planned to. The web columns stand as a testament in any case. The late 2000s were, for Shudō, a time of introspection and quiet living. He had moved out of the hustle of Tokyo and settled in the historic city of Nara, known for its ancient temples and wandering deer. It was perhaps a symbolic choice. Nara is a place where Japan's past is deeply present, a fitting home for a man carrying so many memories. Shudō had spent part of his childhood in Nara due to his father's job as a public official, so it was also a homecoming of sorts. In Nara, life moves at a gentler pace than the capital. One imagines Shudō strolling through Nara Park under the orange leaves of autumn, feeding the deer and reflecting on how strange and full his life had been. From magical girls and space warriors to pocket monsters adored worldwide. He was not very old, 60, 61, but likely felt older given his ailments. There were whispers among acquaintances that Shudō's health was fragile. He had high blood pressure, perhaps liver issues, maybe complications from years of tobacco and alcohol use. And then came October 28th, 2010. That morning, Nara Station bustled as usual with commuters, students, and tourists. The air was crisp. Autumn in Nara carries the scent of dried leaves and a hint of incense from the temples. Takeshi Shudō was at the station, possibly preparing to take a train, perhaps to Tokyo for a meeting, or maybe just a local train for an errand. He had a bit of time before his train, so he stepped into the smoking room on the platform, a small designated area walled off by glass, where passengers could have a quick cigarette. It was shortly after 6 a.m. Inside the smoking room, the neon lighting was harsh. Shudō took out a cigarette and lit it. Did he think about anything in that moment? Maybe he was planning his day, or maybe his mind was blank, simply savoring the morning nicotine routine. We will never know, because in the next moment, Takeshi Shudō suddenly collapsed to the floor without a word. A passerby saw the middle-aged man in the beige coat and hat crumple to the ground and shouted for help. Panic ensued briefly on the platform. Staff rushed in, an ambulance was called. Shudō was breathing but unconscious. He was hurried to the nearest hospital. There, doctors quickly realized he had suffered a massive subarachnoid hemorrhage, a brutal type of stroke caused by a blood vessel rupturing in the brain. Surgery was performed to relieve pressure and stop the bleeding as much as possible. Machines kept his body alive, but Shudō's mind had already journeyed far beyond their reach. For nearly a day he lay in a coma, in intensive care. His family came. One can imagine the shock and grief of his wife or children. His public biography seldom mentions them, as he kept his private life very private, but it's known he had a family. Colleagues and friends likely got word through rapid phone calls. Did you hear about Shudō-san? He collapsed. It's bad. Some might have gone to see him, though he wouldn't have known they were there. In the early hours of October 29th, 2010, as the city of Nara slept under a cloudy sky, Takeshi Shudō's brave, tormented heart gave out. He died at 4:03 a.m., according to official reports. He was 61 years old. The news hit the anime industry and Pokémon fans around the world later that day. Pokémon writer, 61, dies. Headlines like that ran in various outlets. Animation Magazine noted how Shudō had worked extensively on Pokémon and other series, and mentioned the cause of death plainly. Kotaku, a gaming news site, also ran a piece acknowledging Shudō's contributions and untimely passing. Even Western gaming sites recognized his name by then. To many who grew up with Pokémon, it was a strange moment. Some realized they hadn't known who was responsible for the show's early magic until they read his obituary. Now they discovered his name at the same time they learned of his death. Tributes poured in quietly from those who had worked with Shudō. Kunihiko Yuyama, the Pokémon anime's long-standing chief director and Shudō's close collaborator, spoke warmly of Shudō's imagination and how he set the compass for the series in its formative years. He was a genius at mixing the absurd and the profound, Yuyama said in essence at a small memorial. Others recalled how Shudō would mumble seemingly unrelated phrases or jokes during story meetings that later would prove to be seeds of brilliant ideas. Many noted his unique sense of humor. Even in serious scripts, he'd find a way to insert a pun or a bit of wordplay, often untranslatable, which voice actors loved performing. In early 2011, the Suginami Animation Museum in Tokyo held a memorial exhibition titled In Memoriam of the Screenwriter Takeshi Shudō, displaying some of Shudō's handwritten notes, script drafts, and memorabilia from the series he worked on. Fans who visited could see, for example, Shudō's original series composition notebook for Pokémon, pages upon pages of neatly written episode concepts and character arcs. There was said to be a section showing Shudō's contributions to Magical Princess Minky Momo, one of his famous pre-Pokémon works. In that show's final episode, airing back in 1983, Shudō had made a bold and grim choice. Since the series was abruptly cancelled, He wrote an ending where the 12-year-old magical girl, Momo, having lost her powers, is struck and killed by a truck. It was shocking and bittersweet. Momo dies, but is later reborn as a baby to her previous parents, and that ending became infamous in anime history. At the memorial, a letter from a colleague joked that Shudō had a penchant for literally killing his darlings when circumstances forced his hand. Yet, for all his flirtations with darkness, Shudō's legacy in Pokémon is one of empathy and gentle humanism. He gave us a world where a boy saying goodbye to his Butterfree could bring a lump to the throat, where even the clownish Team Rocket could move us to pity when we saw their backstory of broken homes and dreams, where a wild Pikachu deciding to stay with its human friend could feel like a triumph of love over instinct. Shudō was the architect of those moments. He never got to end the story the way he imagined, but perhaps that's fitting. Pokemon's journey continues even now, and Shudō's spirit quietly lingers in it. Consider this: in 2017, the Pokemon Company released a feature film titled Pokemon the Movie, I Choose You, which was an alternative retelling of Ash's origin and early adventures. In the credits of that film, they gave a nod to Takeshi Shudō as a partial screenwriter, because the movie drew heavily from the first TV episode he wrote 20 years prior. It was a subtle tribute, but an important one, acknowledging that the current torchbearers stood on the shoulders of his work. And in recent years, the anime itself, while still largely episodic, occasionally returned to themes that were distinctly Shudō-esque. For instance, the idea of Pokemon and humans understanding each other's hearts was explored with more nuance, and older characters he developed, like Team Rocket, were treated with respect to their history. What of Lugia, the magnificent creature that symbolized both the pinnacle of Shudō's creative freedom and the nadir of his personal despair? For a long time after the year 2000, Lugia indeed faded away from prominence, as if the franchise itself respected an unwritten taboo. Unlike Pikachu, Charizard, or even fellow legendary Mewtwo, who got follow-up appearances, Lugia rarely showed up. It had a brief 3-episode arc in the anime in 2002, the Mother Lugia and Baby Silver storyline during the Johto season, and then it sank into cameo status. Years went by with only fleeting glimpses, a silhouette in an opening montage here, a minor mention there. One could almost imagine that Lugia, like some mythical beast, had retreated to the bottom of the ocean to mourn the loss of the one human who truly understood it. Then, almost a decade after Shudō's death, Lugia rose again in the Pokémon anime. In 2020, during the series Pokémon Journeys, the very first episode treated longtime fans to a stunning surprise. Ash encountered a wild Lugia and spent an entire day riding on its back as it flew across the seas and skies. There were no villains, no battles to be won, just a boy and a legendary Pokémon sharing a moment of awe and freedom. Ash laughed in sheer joy as Lugia dove underwater and then soared up, causing rainbows in its mist. Notably, Lugia did not speak in human language during this encounter. There was no telepathic voice, just its natural haunting cries. In that silence, there was something almost sacred. It's as if the writers chose not to assign any gender or human-like voice to Lugia, this time leaving it truly enigmatic and majestic. Watching that episode, older fans couldn't help but feel a swell of emotion. Many knew about Shudō's connection to Lugia by then. The story had spread through fandom lore. To them, that scene felt like Lugia was paying tribute to its creator, allowing Ash, standing in perhaps for Shudō, or for all of us, to experience the pure wonder of the world from Lugia's perspective, if only for a short time. The episode's end showed Lugia departing as mysteriously as it arrived, disappearing into the clouds and back to the depths. Ash thanks it for the ride and maybe for something more. Nothing else is said. It was subtle but profoundly moving for those who understood. Perhaps it was the franchise's way of being faithful, at last, to Shudō's intentions for Lugia, to let it simply be what it is, beyond human labels, a creature of two worlds bridging sky and sea. Takeshi Shudō's story is one of brilliance and tragedy intertwined. He was a man who gave a generation of children their warm, nostalgic adventure of youth, yet he himself seemed burdened by a sense of unfulfilled purpose and loneliness. In the end, he could not defeat the real-world demons of stress and substance, reliance that shadowed him. One might say he followed the classic path of many gifted storytellers, flying high, flying too close to the sun, and falling before his time. But what he left behind continues to resonate. In quiet corners of the internet, fans continue to discuss his blog writings, marveling at what Pokémon could have been in some alternate timeline where Shudō had free reign. They swap translations of passages, preserving his words. The Pokémon should cry when they feel like crying, laugh when they feel like laughing. Shudō wrote about honest storytelling, and ironically, those very words cause readers to cry or laugh as they recognize how much genuine care he had for this work. At conventions or online panels, whenever younger writers or producers of Pokémon are asked about the early days, they invariably bow their heads in respect to Shudō. He's often called Pokémon's first true visionary, and indeed he was. He saw Pokémon not just as a kid's pastime, but as a vessel to talk about life, loss, and love in a language kids could understand. He made sure that the Pokémon world, for all its fantasy, reflected real feelings. There is an almost folkloric quality to how Shudō's tale is told now. Imagine a group of Pokémon fans gathered around a campfire, or perhaps more fittingly, around the warm glow of a television on a dark night, sharing the lore behind the show's creation. The story of Takeshi Shudō comes out like a ghost story or a cautionary tale. Once there was a man who dreamed of a very different Pokémon world. They speak of his name with reverence, recount the wild ideas he had, the battles he fought with the higher-ups, and how it all ended too soon. It's not a widely known story to the general public, but to those who delve into the history of Pokémon, it feels like discovering a secret, something almost forbidden or sacred that was hidden in an archive and now unearthed. One can draw a parallel between Shudō and one of his most famous creations, Mewtwo. Both in a way were searching for meaning in a world that wanted them to play a predefined role. Mewtwo asked, "What is my purpose if I was created by humans?" Shudō might have asked, "What is my purpose as a creator if my creations are ultimately bent by corporate will?" Mewtwo rebelled violently, Shudō rebelled through subtext and imagination, and contemplated doing more. In the end, Mewtwo finds a sort of peace, flying off to find its place in the world, its memory wiped from humans so it could start anew. Did Shudō find peace? We hope that in the final years of writing his blogs, venting his soul, he found some catharsis. The fact that he continued to champion the messages of coexistence and understanding in his reflections suggests that he hadn't given up on the ideals, even if he lamented how things turned out. Perhaps the truest memorial to Takeshi Shudō isn't in any plaque or museum, but within the Pokémon narrative itself, which he helped shape. Every time the show or movies touch on a deep theme, you can sense his ghost. For instance, when Ash in a recent series released a Pokémon friend so it could pursue its own happiness, echoing Butterfree's goodbye so many years ago, that gentle tug at the heartstrings is Shudō's doing. He established that Pokémon was allowed to be bittersweet. Whenever Team Rocket shows a glimmer of humanity behind their antics, like shedding a tear over a Pokémon they care for or reminiscing about their childhoods, that's Shudō's legacy, reminding us that even clowns are people with feelings. And every time the anime underscores friendship, loyalty, and coexistence over competition, you can hear Shudō whisper through the script, "This is what it's all about." He had always said Pokémon's ultimate journey was about discovering how to coexist with others. The series, in its endless journey across regions, time and again lands on that lesson. In one of his last blog entries, Shudō wrote with a touch of wistfulness, "After 3 or 4 years, a new Pokémon adventure with a new main hero should begin. With its own topics, this new Pokémon should adapt to its times." He believed in renewal, that the story should refresh with new faces and new ideas to remain meaningful. The Pokémon anime did eventually do this, but only 20-something years later. In 2023, Ash's own story finally concluded, a new protagonist took over, an outcome Shudō had mused about long ago. How he would have smiled at that. Ash Ketchum, the boy who never grew up under his pen, was at last allowed to win a world championship and then step out of the spotlight. A journey ending so another could begin, exactly as Shudō proposed back in 2009. It's almost poetic justice that reality caught up to his vision in the end, even if posthumously. The anime's producers likely looked back at Shudō's notes when designing Ash's send-off. Knowingly or not, because Ash's final episodes brimmed with nostalgia and quiet reflection, not unlike the Old Man Ash scenario minus the aging. Lugia, the maternal Pokémon that Shudō created, remains a symbol of his own creative spirit. Elusive, majestic, touched by sorrow, but full of power. Whenever Lugia appears, fans recall Shudō's struggle and passion. Even the official Pokédex lore for Lugia speaks of it as a creature that chooses isolation in the deep to avoid causing storms with its mighty wings. That sounds like a mythologized Shudō, a brilliant being who exiled himself, in his case was true, because the force of his ideas was too great for the status quo. Tonight, perhaps, Lugia slumbers still in the abyss of the sea in Pokémon lore, and in the collective memory of Pokémon fans, Takeshi Shudō slumbers as well, remembered when we tell the tale of how one man's dream shaped an empire of dreams. There is a phrase from the second movie's theme song, The Power of One, that goes, "And you could hear the voice of courage ringing out your name." In that film, it referred to Ash finding the courage to do the impossible, but in a way, the power of one also refers to Shudō himself, the power of one writer, one individual, to influence the hearts of millions. If you find yourself one of these nights re-watching the old Pokémon episodes, or perhaps the Lugia movie, pay attention to the atmosphere, the little emotional beats between the action. Listen to the silence between words, the space where something unspoken lives. That is where you can feel Takeshi Shudō. In the quiet, in the subtle, in the unexpectedly profound moment amid adventure. It's as though he's there, gently nudging our childhood selves to notice the bigger picture, to feel something more. And when Lugia rises, silver wings outstretched against the moonlight, and that lonely, keening cry echoes, imagine it not just as a monster's call, but as a requiem for the man who dreamed it into being. Lugia's song is a lullaby for all that is wild and gentle, a song of life's balance and the hope that one day we truly understand each other. Takeshi Shudō wrote that song in metaphor, and in doing so he bared a piece of his soul to the world. The cabin is quiet now, the fire low, as this tale reaches its end. Outside, the wind howls softly, like the distant cry of a great bird. Perhaps it's just the night breeze, or perhaps it is Lugia, singing goodbye. We close the file and let the night take us, grateful for the memory of a storyteller named Takeshi Shudō, a man who gave voice to a generation's imagination and whose own story will forever remain intertwined with the legend of Lugia, in sorrow and in wonder. That's it for tonight, lads. The storm has passed, the fire's low. Somewhere out there, Lugia sleeps beneath the waves again, a guardian born from one man's dream, now echoing across generations. Takeshi Shudō may be gone, but what he gave us remains. Not just a character, not just a creature, but a feeling. A deeper kind of wonder tucked inside something we once thought was just for kids. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll subscribe. It helps this podcast grow, and you never know what story from a beloved world will drift through the cabin next. Until then, sleep well, and good night.